Hello everyone, I'm Brior and welcome back. In today's video, we'll be taking a look at the Stillfront Group. It's the company that bought Goodgame Studios back in 2018. I thought now would be a good time to take a look at Stillfront here on the channel because we're still in the middle of my complete history of Empire series, and at various points in that series, the history of Goodgame Studios as a company has been relevant. Additionally, Stillfront's logo was recently added to the loading screen for Goodgame Empire, so more people are becoming aware of it. Thirdly, and relatedly, in Goodgame Empire's official Discord, I've seen some users suggesting that perhaps Stillfront is responsible for the increasing monetization in Empire's latest updates. Is Stillfront ruining the game? Well, that's a question I hope to tentatively arrive at an answer to in today's video. Finally, here on YouTube, on the community tab on my channel, I put out a poll asking you all what video you'd like to see next, and taking a deeper look into Stillfront was the winning option by a significant margin. So here we are. As usual, I'll try to provide this video with some sense of organization. We'll be hitting a number of topics, each of which will have its own chapter here on YouTube. So if you're interested in only a particular piece of the video, feel free to jump ahead. We'll begin, though, by talking about the history and founding of Goodgame Studios. I'll be brief about this because it's come up a few times already in my complete history of Goodgame Empire series, but I think it's useful to understand a few things about Goodgame Studios just as a way of completing the story of Goodgame Studios' acquisition by Stillfront. And I, for one, am interested to know a few things about the founders of Goodgame Empire, including, I'd like to know where they've ended up, and whether they're still involved with Goodgame Empire in any capacity. After talking about the founding of Goodgame Studios, I'll discuss 2016, again, very briefly, but that was a very important year in the history of Goodgame Studios as a company because it went through a restructuring. Goodgame Studios laid off almost half of its workforce, and I think in many ways 2016 set things up for some other company to come in and acquire Goodgame Studios in the years that followed. That, of course, is exactly what happened. Stillfront came in and acquired Goodgame Studios in 2018. So, we'll talk about who Stillfront are, and what their vision for Goodgame Studios and Goodgame Empire was at the time of the acquisition. In preparing to make this video, I've looked at a whole bunch of different resources. Everything from interviews with Goodgame Studios' founders to Stillfront's financial documents. And while we're not going to go in depth on the financial performance of Stillfront as a whole, there were certain pieces of those financial documents that were relevant to Goodgame Empire. So I've pulled them out and I'll present them to you in today's video. I've even taken the liberty of putting together a few charts and graphs based on the information that Stillfront has provided us about the performance of the Empire franchise. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how much the average player who spends money on Goodgame Empire spends per month. I was taken aback myself by that information. Alright, enough blubbering, let's get started. Goodgame Studios was founded in 2009 by the brothers Christian and Kai Wurzanek, as well as a man named Fabian Ritter. We know a lot more about the brothers. Both of them were professionals in other industries before founding Goodgame Studios. Kai was a lawyer, just like yours truly, whereas Christian had a PhD in orthodontics, making him a dentist. Evidently, they decided that video games were a lot more interesting. They founded Goodgame Studios by taking a €500,000 loan from a savings bank, and Goodgame Studios' original business model was to identify and acquire flash game portal websites. If you've been around on the internet for a while, you might remember that flash game portal websites used to be pretty popular. One example would be Miniclip, which is, I know, how a lot of players initially found Goodgame Empire. Well, at this stage, Goodgame Studios wasn't actually in the business of developing video games. It was only in the business of acquiring these types of websites. One of the websites it acquired was coolspiele.com, which is German for coolgames.com. And at the time, as the brothers remarked in an interview with GamesIndustry.biz, these websites were only really monetized through third-party advertisements. There wasn't much in the way of monetization within the games themselves. So, pretty soon, the founders of Goodgame Studios got the idea to make Flash games with built-in monetization. The first few games that Goodgame Studios developed were things like Goodgame Poker or Goodgame Farmer. Around this time, the company had only about 10 employees, and on its first game, apparently, Kai Warzenek did the programming, and Christian Warzenek did the art. Goodgame Studios used the money that came in from these first few games to develop other titles, everything from Goodgame Hercules to Goodgame Mafia. Its games had a leg up over the competition because Goodgame Studios owned several Flash game portal websites where those games would appear. As a result, Goodgame Studios really didn't have to spend anything on marketing to get users to start playing its games. By the time Goodgame Studios released the beta of Empire in August of 2011, it had grown rapidly to over 100 employees. As its founders explained, the principal challenges that Goodgame Studios was facing were all related to growing the company. Goodgame Studios very quickly needed more employees and larger offices. In fact, the company bought other games development companies solely for the purpose of acquiring their employees. Soon after its release, Goodgame Empire was by far and away Goodgame Studios' biggest success. Goodgame Studios followed Empire up with another game called Big Farm, which obviously I haven't really talked about here on the channel, but that's popular in its own right. This quote from Kai Warzenek in the GamesIndustry.biz article, where he says that diversification is probably not the best approach, but that instead companies should try to focus on being really good at one thing, is kind of ironic in hindsight because, as we know from the complete history of Goodgame Empire series, diversification is exactly what Goodgame Studios did. Goodgame Studios grew to over 1,200 employees and opened several sub-studios, including teams that were working on developing games that weren't free-to-play browser games, like Empire or Big Farm, but were instead maybe even going to be console games. Ultimately, the games that Goodgame Studios released in the years following Big Farm, including things like Legends of Honor, were not nearly as successful, and by 2016, the founders and the company realized that it had to pull back. Accordingly, in 2016, over 600 employees at Goodgame Studios were laid off, with another 200 being laid off early in 2017. It was a major restructuring, and I think it was a turning point in the history of Goodgame Studios as a company. From that point onwards, Goodgame Studios committed to focusing on its core areas of existing success, namely developing free-to-play browser and mobile games. That's why Empire wasn't really as affected as the rest of Goodgame Studios' business by this restructuring. What's interesting, though, is that the games industry has changed over the course of the past 10 years. You might have noticed that Flash game portal websites are not nearly as popular today as they were 12 or so years ago. In fact, even by 2016, there were already signs that Flash was a dying technology, soon to be replaced by HTML5. Perhaps it was these changes in the industry, as well as the tumultuous restructuring at Goodgame Studios, that caused Goodgame Studios' founders to open up to the idea of selling the company. Perhaps they thought that Goodgame Studios would be better positioned to respond to the changes if it was one in a number of game studios under a collective brand. This, of course, is where Stillfront comes in. So now we're looking at a press release that was put out by the Stillfront Group when it agreed to purchase Goodgame Studios. Up until this point, Goodgame Studios had been a private company, owned principally by Christian and Kai Warzenek, as well as Mr. Ritter. However, the Stillfront Group has been a publicly held and traded company, meaning it has stocks that you can buy. You, indirectly, can purchase a partial ownership share in Goodgame Studios and thus Goodgame Empire. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. As we'll see later on in this video, the stock of Stillfront has plummeted in recent years, but here's what the press release says. Stillfront Group has today entered into an agreement to acquire 100% of the shares in Goodgame Studios for a consideration of 270 million euros. Following the transaction, the owners of Goodgame Studios will hold approximately 36.5% of the outstanding shares and votes in Stillfront. With this transaction, the founders of Goodgame Studios, who are also the CEO and CSO, respectively, Dr. Kai and Christian Warzenek, will become the major holders in Stillfront through their holding company, Laureus Capital. In addition, Christian Warzenek is proposed to be elected as a new member of the Stillfront Board of Directors, subject to the completion of the transaction. So what does that all mean? Well, essentially, we already know Goodgame Studios was sold to Stillfront. What this tells us, though, is that the owners of Goodgame Studios remained partial owners of Goodgame Studios because the consideration that they were paid for selling their company was in large part stocks or ownership interests in Stillfront. Additionally, both of the founders remained involved even after the sale of their company, in Christian's case as a member of the board of directors of Stillfront, and I think Kai remained an officer or an employee of Goodgame Studios specifically. Over time, both of the brothers became farther and farther removed from actual control over the development of Goodgame Empire, but what this shows is that they didn't immediately dump all of their ownership interest. So now we need to answer the question of what the heck is Stillfront? Well, we know it's a publicly held and traded company, but Stillfront's business model is more or less what the original business model of Goodgame Studios was. Rather than developing any of its own games, Stillfront simply identifies other game development studios that it thinks are well positioned to succeed in the future and buys them through a merger and acquisition process. Goodgame Studios was merely one of the studios that Stillfront bought, although at the time, Goodgame was definitely the largest. As a result, it stands to reason that the management in charge at Stillfront has less to do with the actual development of any of these games, and is probably a bit less passionate about the development of the games, if we're being honest, but has more to do with monetizing the games and other administrative and background changes to try and make the operation of the games as efficient or as lucrative as possible. If we scroll down here, we can see some quotes from the founders of Goodgame Studios as well as the CEO of Stillfront. I'll just read this first one here, because none of these quotes actually tell us that much. Goodgame Studios and Stillfront are a perfect strategic fit, forming a true European gaming champion with compelling complementary game portfolios and operational synergies. We look forward to working together to further grow and develop the business. So, what operational synergies could Jürgen Larsson be talking about there? Well, again, it's the idea that perhaps Stillfront could oversee the transition of all of its games, not just Empire and Big Farm, but its entire portfolio of games to HTML5. Maybe Stillfront could pay for the servers to run its games and could obtain a discount by doing those kinds of things in bulk. Additionally, Stillfront might be responsible for marketing Goodgame Empire, like running an advertising campaign. Or, even though Stillfront appears not to really exercise much control over what kinds of content are added to Empire in terms of the future updates, Stillfront probably directs studios about how to monetize the games. If we scroll a little further down here, these few paragraphs tell us about the history of Stillfront and kind of how it operates. Stillfront is a group of leading creators, publishers, and distributors of digital games, aiming to become a leading indie game developer and publisher. Stillfront is active within 3 gaming segments: the PC console segment, the mobile game segment, and the browser game segment, with focus on free-to-play strategy games on mobile and browser. The company owns semi-autonomous game studios with global reach on multiple platforms and with operations in a whole bunch of companies. Again, the word semi-autonomous here really signals that Stillfront isn't responsible for controlling the content and the direction of the games, merely things like the monetization and back-end administrative type things. A core element within Stillfront's business model is to actively identify, evaluate, and acquire interesting gaming companies active in the mobile and browser strategy genre. If we scroll a bit further down, Stillfront says, the acquisition of Goodgame Studios will significantly strengthen Stillfront's market position and game portfolio. The two companies are active within the same game genre, focusing mainly on free-to-play strategy games. The combination of Stillfront's broad portfolio with Goodgame Studios' two blockbuster IPs, that would be Empire and Big Farm, makes the portfolios great complements. Furthermore, the strategy genre typically sees a sticky customer base and long game life cycles, enabling steady revenue streams with additional upside from new game launches. So, here we start to get a sense of why Goodgame Studios would have purchased, or rather Stillfront would have purchased Goodgame Studios. It saw Empire and Big Farm as stable games that would continue to bring in revenue moving forward with minimal investment in new content, let's say, from Stillfront. It's kind of weird to see Stillfront describing the player base of Empire, including you and I, as sticky, but I guess they simply mean that players who tend to get invested in Empire have a hard time moving on, which I know personally. Moving on, it says, Stillfront expects the acquisition of Goodgame Studios to result in a number of potential synergies and increased growth opportunities directly upon completion of the transaction. The companies have identified synergies within performance-based marketing, monetization, shared use of technology, as well as cost reductions. So that basically is what I've already been talking about. Certain aspects of Goodgame Studios' business could be combined with other studios to reduce costs. Like, for example, Goodgame Studios probably doesn't have its own customer service team anymore. Stillfront has a customer service team that services customers of all or most of Stillfront's games. By employing fewer people, they reduce costs and increase profit margins. So now you might have an idea of why it's taken Goodgame Studios so long to respond to your tickets, if you've ever had to ask for help in Goodgame Empire. Finally, if I scroll down here, I think I had highlighted one other thing that I wanted to point out with regards to Stillfront. Here it is. Stillfront's dividend policy is to distribute annual dividends up to 50% of the group's net profit. So what does this mean? Well, we get a sense that the investors in Stillfront, including the founders of Goodgame Studios, really expected to profit from their ownership of Stillfront in two ways. Firstly, if the company did well, then its stock price would go up, and that stock could be sold at a later time for more money than had initially been spent to acquire it. That's how shareholders in a corporation typically make profit. Dividends are where the company takes the money it's made, for example, the money that comes in from games like Empire, and pays it out to shareholders. What this press release tells us is that Stillfront had a policy of distributing annual dividends up to 50% of the group's net profit. My understanding is that is a very high percent of profit to distribute as dividends. Typically, rather than distributing dividends, companies will take the profit that they make and reinvest it, say by developing more video games or acquiring more game studios to make even more money and increase the share price that much more. So it's unusual for a company to pay out that much in dividends. Thinking about this from the perspective of the founders of Goodgame Studios, who, as we know, retained an ownership interest in Stillfront, they may have done that because they wanted to continue receiving a substantial cut of the revenue brought in by Goodgame Empire, and that's how they would have done that right there. Alright, so let's now consider the performance of Goodgame Empire under the management of Stillfront. Here I am at the website for the Stillfront Group. You can see that, as they're required to by law, they've put out quarterly reports showing, among other things, how much money they've made. The most recent quarterly reports really don't tell us anything about Goodgame Empire, nor do they mention Goodgame Empire, because in the years since, Stillfront has acquired even more games, and Empire now represents a smaller share of its business. But if we go back several years, say to 2018, I'll just open up one of these reports to give you an idea of what it looks like. Here we are. So I'll scroll through somewhat slowly and you can have a look at what the report is like. All sorts of financial terminology is used here. Data about Stillfront's business is presented, and the whole document is more or less an advertisement to try and get more people to invest in the company. So they try to present any losses as expected and any gains as better than expected or could have been hoped for. Anyways, you can see Empire or Big Farm appear a couple times in the report, and if we scroll even further down, information about the number of users who are actively playing Goodgame Empire can be found. You can see on this slide here, yellow represents the Empire franchise, so not only the Empire browser game, but also Four Kingdoms, the mobile version, as well as any other titles in the Empire franchise, although to be honest, I would expect those to be much smaller to the point where they would have a negligible impact on the data that you see here. And the yellow over here tells us that there were 595,000 daily active users in Q1 of 2017, just as an example. So this is the type of information that I relied upon in making my own charts. I went through all of the quarterly reports, and for the quarters where we have data specific to the Empire franchise, again, I put together a number of charts, and I will switch back to the game, but I will put them up on the screen as I discuss them. So here we go. The first chart I have shows the number of monthly active users in the Empire franchise from Q1 of 2017 to Q3 of 2019. And you can see that the number has declined from a starting point of 2,280,000 to an end point of 1,244,000, or a little over half. Again, Q3 2019 is unfortunately the most recent data we have because Stillfront stopped reporting numbers specifically for the Empire franchise at that point. However, that is a pretty substantial drop-off. Now I'll add in the number of daily active users, which you can see in red. That declined from a starting point of about 595,000 to, most recently, an endpoint of 284,000. Even though it might not look it, the drop-off of daily active users is actually even steeper than the drop-off of monthly active users. 284,000 is less than half of the initial value of 595,000. What really matters to Goodgame Studios, however, is the number of paying users. And here, in orange, you can see the number of monthly paying users. For Q1 2017, it was 92,000. For Q3 of 2019, it was 61,000. So not quite as steep of a drop-off. I'll have another chart in a moment that just shows the number of monthly paying users so you can get a better sense of how it changed quarter to quarter. But what I really wanted to illustrate with this graph was just how small the fraction of monthly active users is that ends up spending money on the game. Only about 5% of players spend money. As promised, here's that chart that specifically shows only the number of monthly paying users. Again, you can see that it's a slight decline, but it's not as steep as before. Goodgame Studios, however, has partially made up for this decline in the number of paying users by increasing the average revenue per monthly paying user. And that's what you can see here. The increase is only slight, but we do see that in Q1 2017, the average amount in United States dollars that a paying user spent on the game was $66.31. By Q3 2019, that had gone up slightly to about $70, but at its height in Q2 2019, it was $86. Again, this is per month, so to be honest, when I first saw these figures, I was kind of taken aback. Honestly, 86 times 12, I'm not sure what that is off the top of my head, but that's about $1,000 per year. That's a lot of money to spend on a browser game. To be clear, I don't think that many players necessarily are spending this much. I would think that the most typical player would spend 20 or 30 bucks a month, spread out in small packages across some of the events. However, there are also players, as we know, who spend hundreds or thousands of dollars on the game in a single go, particularly after features like the Wheel of Affluence were introduced, which unfortunately happened in probably Q4 2019. So after the data that we have, the average revenue per monthly paying user would likely have gone way up as large whales spent even more on the game. Here's another chart. This one is a little redundant from what we saw before, but I just wanted to give you a visual representation showing the percentage of monthly active users who pay money on the game. It's only about 5%, and that's remained relatively constant, at least over the course of the period that we can see. If anything, there's a slight increase, and the most likely explanation for that is the users who pay money are a little stickier, to use Stillfront's language, than those that don't. In other words, the game has lost a greater percentage of free-to-play players than spending players, and you see that reflected in this graph. So overall, if I were to summarize what we've just looked at, I would say that the number of spending players in the game has gone down, but the amount of money that Goodgame Studios and Stillfront extract from them has gone up. And that's a trend that, if I had to guess, I would say it has continued, or likely even strengthened, after Q3 2019, which again, that's the cutoff for the data that we have. But since then, we've seen more features like the Wheel of Unimaginable Affluence and General's offerings that have been gambling features that really have encouraged players to spend a lot of money. We've also seen packages in the shop that have been at prices that were not before seen in the game's history. It used to be that the biggest packages in the game would be worth a few $100s in rubies. Those were the old Super Commanders back in 2014 and onwards. Now, however, we see packages in the game for just individual decorations that are priced at over $800. I'm not sure how many players actually buy those packages, but there are a few. I'm sure I could mouse over to some castles on the server that have those decorations that really can only be acquired in the super expensive offers. So let's take a look now at the financial performance of Stillfront overall. And again, remember what we said a few minutes ago, which is that the owners of Stillfront, the people who own shares, really expected to profit in two ways. Firstly, there's the share price. If that goes up, the shareholders are happy. But secondly, there's the annual dividends, which are based on the group's net annual income. So let's first look at the stock price represented here, and this is in Swedish currency, kronas. We can see that following the acquisition of Goodgame Studios, Stillfront's share price increased to a peak of 100 Swedish krona, but it has since fallen back to 8.31, which I think is around $1 United States dollar, and that is less than the share price at the time Stillfront acquired Goodgame Studios. So on that mark, the company really hasn't been doing that well. Changing now to look at Stillfront's net income in the past few years. I have that information from 2019 onwards. It's represented by the green bars on this chart. Note that some of the more recent years on the right side are actually future years. They're that recent that they're in the future, and it's speculative, so I wouldn't attach that much weight to that information, but we can see that the net income of the Stillfront Group did go up slightly from 2019 to 2020, but since then it's fallen, and in the most recent year, 2023, the net income was basically zero, which is strange because you can see in yellow the revenue of the Stillfront Group has been steadily increasing, or at least has remained quite high. So I don't know specifically what's caused the net income to drop off. Perhaps Stillfront decided to acquire more companies in this particular year, and they spent that money. In all likelihood, the dividends the shareholders received for 2023, if they received any, were low as well. So it has not necessarily been a great time to be an owner of the Stillfront Group or Goodgame Studios. Speaking of the owners of the Stillfront Group, one question that I had is, are the original founders of Goodgame Studios still involved? Do they still have shares? And the answer to that is yes. Christian and Kai Warzenek together have an investment company called Laureus Capital. And we can see here, and this data is from July of 2024, that Laureus Capital is actually the single greatest shareholder in the Stillfront Group. They have over 60 million shares, which represents about 12% of the company. Now, percentage-wise, that's a lot less than the percent of ownership interest that they acquired at the time that Goodgame Studios was sold to the Stillfront Group. I think that was like 35% or something. So their percentage ownership has gone down, but what this tells us is that they are still involved, even though I'm sure they're very far removed from the daily management of Goodgame Studios, and especially from the development direction of Goodgame Empire. Along the way, however, it seems likely that Christian and Kai Warzenek were paid substantial dividends. As we just saw, Stillfront did have a positive net income for 2019, 2020, 2021, etc. And it sure seems like the founders of Goodgame Studios have taken that money that they've made through the dividends and invested that in new companies. Here I am on the LinkedIn page for Dr. Kai Warzenek. We can see that he is the CEO and founder of Impossible Cloud. This is a tech startup that is engaged in cloud computing. And this actually, I think, connects back to Kai's work with Goodgame Empire. Goodgame Empire, of course, lives in the cloud. We all have to connect to the internet in order to play the game. And in the game's early years, the servers were very unstable. So I imagine it was from that frustration of not being able to find a stable cloud hosting company for Goodgame Empire, perhaps that Warzenek got his idea to start up the Impossible Cloud. And I believe those are the kinds of services that his company provides. And here we have the LinkedIn page of Dr. Christian Warzenek. We can see that he is managing director at a company called Ethris, which appears to be a biotech startup. I couldn't tell you much more about it than that. But in sum, Goodgame Studios' original founders are still doing entrepreneurial things, and they are off with their own companies now, pretty far removed from Goodgame Empire. So, have we reached a conclusion? Is Stillfront responsible for the ruination of Goodgame Empire? Well, I don't think it's totally responsible because, to be honest, it simply continued some trends that had quite clearly emerged before the sale of Goodgame Studios to Stillfront. The game's monetization has been tightening since 2013, and although I'm sure that Stillfront was extremely happy when the developers came out with features like the Wheel of Unimaginable Affluence, it's not clear to what extent Stillfront has influenced the development of those features. It's totally possible that Stillfront looked around at the rest of the free-to-play browser and market games industry, browser and mobile games industry, and saw other companies implementing gambling-type features and directed Goodgame Studios to do the same. But exactly to what degree that's been the case, I don't think we can say for sure. I think perhaps Stillfront could be faulted for seemingly not having a plan to grow Goodgame Empire. Rather, their approach to the game has been mostly to treat it as simply a steady source of income. That was the advantage to acquiring Goodgame Empire that Stillfront initially observed in its press release, simply that the game would continue to be a constant source of income even if they didn't invest in new content or marketing for it. It was a low-risk investment. Perhaps that's the reason why all of the game's latest updates seem to tighten the monetization grip even further. On the other hand, Goodgame Empire is 14 years old, and at some point it does become a bit unreasonable to anticipate that the game will always be growing. In fact, the underlying market has changed, and now I think it's far more difficult for games like Empire to organically bring in new users. So, anyways, that's today's video. I very much hope you enjoyed it, and I thank you for watching. If you did enjoy it, please leave a like on the video, get subscribed to the channel, and stay tuned. There should be one other video in August before we go back to the complete history of Goodgame Empire series, which I very much look forward to finishing up. Thanks again for your support, and I'll see you next time.